Have you ever wondered what lurks in the spaces between light and shadow, in those final moments before darkness claims everything? Henry Blackwood had been the keeper of Widow's Point Lighthouse for 37 years. Tonight would be his last. The automation systems arrived tomorrow, rendering his life's work obsolete with cold, mechanical precision. He climbed the spiral stairs one final time, his weathered hands gripping the iron railing that had guided him through countless storms. The lens room felt different tonight. The massive Fresnel lens rotated with its familiar rhythm, casting its beam across the churning Atlantic waters below. But something was wrong. The light seemed dimmer, as if the very air was swallowing its brilliance. Henry adjusted the controls, checked the fuel lines, performed the same routine he had executed thousands of times before. Everything appeared normal, yet the unease in his chest grew stronger with each passing moment. As midnight approached, Henry settled into his chair with a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The logbook lay open before him, its pages filled with decades of weather reports, ship sightings, and maintenance notes, written in his careful script. His final entry would be simple. All systems operational. Duty complete. That's when he heard it. A sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. The unmistakable groan of metal under stress, coming from somewhere deep within the lighthouse structure. Henry knew every sound this old tower made, from the whistle of wind through the lamp room vents to the settling of stone foundations against the rocky cliff. This was something else entirely. He grabbed his flashlight and descended the stairs, each step echoing in the narrow confines of the tower. The sound came again, louder this time, accompanied by what sounded like voices carried on the wind. But that was impossible. The nearest inhabited land was 12 miles away, and no ships were scheduled to pass tonight. The beam of his flashlight danced across the walls as he reached the middle level, where his modest living quarters occupied a section of the circular space. Everything appeared normal until the light fell upon the small porthole window facing the ocean. Pressed against the glass was a face. Henry's heart hammered against his ribs as he stumbled backward. The face was pale, gaunt, with eyes that seemed to hold depths darker than the ocean itself. Water streamed down the glass, though no rain fell tonight. The face moved its mouth as if speaking, but Henry heard nothing except the pounding of his own pulse. He blinked, and the face vanished. Trembling, Henry approached the window. The glass was dry. No trace of water, no evidence of the apparition he had just witnessed. He pressed his face to the porthole and peered out into the darkness. The lighthouse beams swept across empty waters, revealing nothing but white-capped waves stretching to the horizon. Returning to the lens room, Henry tried to rationalize what he had seen. 37 years of isolation could play tricks on a man's mind. The stress of leaving his life's work behind had probably manifested in hallucinations. He had heard of such things happening to lighthouse keepers before. The solitude, the endless rhythm of the light, the constant sound of wind and waves, it could drive a man to see things that weren't there. But as he climbed the final steps to the lamp room, Henry knew he was lying to himself. What he had seen was real as the lighthouse itself, as real as the ocean that surrounded this lonely outcropping of rock. The temperature in the lens room had dropped noticeably. Henry's breath formed small clouds as he checked the heating system, but the gauges showed normal operation. The cold seemed to emanate from the lighthouse itself, seeping from the very stones that had stood sentinel against the Atlantic storms for over a century. As the clock struck 1 in the morning, the lighthouse beam began to flicker. Henry rushed to the controls, but every indicator showed perfect function. The massive lens continued its rotation. The electric systems hummed with steady power, yet the beam pulsed erratically, sending irregular flashes across the water. That's when Henry saw them. Ships, dozens of them, materializing in the flickering light like photographs, developing in a dark room. Old sailing vessels with tattered sails and broken masts, modern cargo ships listing heavily to one side, fishing boats with empty nets dragging behind them, all of them heading directly toward the rocky shore below the lighthouse. Henry rubbed his eyes, certain he was experiencing some kind of breakdown. But when he looked again, the ships remained. They moved through the water with unnatural silence, leaving no wakes, creating no sound as they approached the jagged rocks that had claimed so many vessels over the years. He grabbed the radio, his hands shaking as he tried to contact the Coast Guard. Static filled the speakers, punctuated by what sounded like voices speaking in languages he couldn't understand. The voices grew louder, more urgent, overlapping until they became a cacophony of desperate pleas and warnings. The lighthouse beam suddenly stabilized, burning brighter than Henry had ever seen it. But instead of its usual white light, the beam now pulsed with a sickly green glow that seemed to pull the phantom ships closer to shore. Henry realized with growing horror that the lighthouse wasn't warning the ships away from danger. It was calling them home. Memories flooded back, suppressed recollections that Henry had buried deep in his subconscious. Stories the previous keeper had told him during his first week on the job. Stories about ships that had vanished without explanation, about lights seen beneath the water on calm nights, about voices that called out from the depths during storms. The old keeper had been drunk when he told those stories, rambling about his duty to feed the light and keep the hungry ones satisfied. Henry had dismissed the tales as the ravings of a man who had spent too many years alone with nothing but wind and waves for company. Now he understood the terrible truth. The lighthouse had been built on this particular outcropping for a reason, not to save ships, but to claim them. Generation after generation of keepers had maintained the light, believing they were preserving life while actually serving something far more sinister. The automation wouldn't just replace Henry. It would break the cycle, leave the hungry spirits without a human conduit to channel their malevolent power. As the phantom fleet drew closer to shore, Henry felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, dreading what he might see. The lens room was filled with figures, translucent and wavering like heat mirages. Sailors from every era, their clothes dripping with seawater, their eyes reflecting the same unnatural light that now blazed from the lighthouse beam. They weren't malevolent, Henry realized. They were trapped, bound to this place by forces beyond their understanding. The lighthouse didn't just guide ships to their doom. It collected the souls of those who perished, adding them to an ever-growing congregation of the lost. One figure stepped forward, more solid than the others. Henry recognized him as Captain Morrison, whose merchant vessel had vanished 3 years ago during a particularly violent storm. Morrison's lips moved, and Henry heard words that chilled him to his core. "Your watch isn't over, Henry. It will never be over. The light must have a keeper, and the keeper must have a purpose. Welcome to the eternal shift." Henry looked down at his hands and saw they were becoming translucent, fading like morning mist. He tried to speak, to scream, but no sound emerged from his throat. The realization hit him with crushing finality. He had died hours ago, perhaps days ago. His body lay somewhere below, probably discovered by the automation crew, who would find nothing more than an old man who had worked himself to death on his final night of duty. The phantom ships began to fade as dawn approached, returning to whatever realm they inhabited between the hours of darkness. The lighthouse beam returned to its normal white glow, resuming its protective function for the living world above. But Henry remained, transparent and eternal, taking his place among the spectral crew that would forever tend the light. As the sun rose over Widow's Point Lighthouse, automated systems hummed to life in the lamp room. The new technology would maintain the beacon with perfect efficiency, never knowing that its light was guided by hands that no longer cast shadows, tended by a keeper whose final duty would last for all eternity. Somewhere in the lens room, barely visible in the morning light, Henry Blackwood began his endless watch, forever trapped between the world of the living and the hungry depths below.